This is the Battle of Brandywine for the History 4810 project. What this is the unabridged, I guess, completely uncut version of the battle practically from the beginning until later. This battle, just as a bit of preface, this battle occurs on September 11th, 1777, between the British forces and colonials. Howe had incidentally decided that he wanted to sail south to try and outmaneuver the Americans and intercept them. Outmaneuver them, move south to try and attack Philadelphia because he felt it was exposed. Burgoyne and Gates were under another plan, and I believe Howe was meant to just sit put. And what we're observing here is sort of the setup that I have of the battle. This is Birmingham Hill, which a lot of the fighting existed on historically. Now, what you didn't see this destroyed cannon. One of the biggest problems with this battle that existed at the time when we had played it, me and a friend of mine named Ross, is the battle. So the battle that was preset by the developers of the game had the British with only 2 cannons, and they were both 6-pounders. And historically speaking, the British had some 6-pounders, but they were carrying a lot of 12. The American forces had a lot less cannon, and by and large, I think they only had 1 6-pounder and quite a few 4. The game gave the Americans 4 separate units of 24-pound guns, which was just ridiculous. And part of the problem with that is it gives the Americans a massive artillery advantage, which is completely historically inaccurate for this battle because the British would have outgunned the Americans in that regard. What you see here is the large flanking force that Ross had planned on doing. What happened historically is Cornwallis was sent off on the British left flank, the American right, to do this large countering maneuver. Howe apparently was a real big fan of flanking maneuvers, and so he sent Cornwallis on this large, wide flanking maneuver out around the side of the ford, on another ford. What we're looking at there for a second is Chad's Ford across the river. As I was speaking earlier, Washington had actually set up on one side of the river, hoping to intercept Howe before he made it to Philadelphia. And Howe's goal was to take Philadelphia, believing that it would change the war dramatically. And so, as I was saying, the artillery was a big deal. So, in order to make this more historically accurate, we left the Americans with 1 artillery unit and destroyed like 3 of them. We marched 3 into the corner of the map and had them all executed, as traitorous as that seems. As luck would have it, though, because the 24-pounders have such a grand range, despite the fact we got rid of most of the artillery that the Americans had and left them with 1 artillery unit, I still managed to get rid of and just destroy, out of nowhere, one of the 2 6-pound units that the British had, which left them with 1 6-pound unit. And a little bit earlier, you saw Ross had actually marched one of the 6-pounders across the river to actually exchange fire. And so I brought some long rifles. Jeffries or Jefferson? There is a well-known sort of ranger unit that the Americans had that was there, and that's probably what's represented by the long rifles here. I marched them over to try and snipe them, but they're just a little bit too far out of the way. So Ross set up on this hill, hoping that he could hit my 24-pound, unfortunately, 24-pound cannon sit in the other side of the hill, and it looks like my 24-pound are still trying to hit some cavalry that are over across the river. This is a really good shot of the of how well the game does the animations and sets up the you can see these British soldiers reloading the 6-pound gun and firing. I believe they do. Yeah, we could see it here. They do manage to get rid of one of the carriages and horses, making it so I couldn't transport those cannons. Over here is my flanking force. So historically, like I said, Cornwallis had this massive flanking force, but the British sort of split the forces. What Ross decided to do after many tries, we played this battle a few times. It's just a massacre trying to march across Chad's Ford, and it really doesn't work out so well for the British. As you see, there are spikes there across the river. I'll mention that later. And so he decided to do the bulk of his force and send them around the left flank, the British left flank, the American right. And so what you see here is very minimal force to keep them from just running across the ford. But by and large, I moved most of my forces to this flanking fight so that we'd have this big battle over on this field that's a bit, I believe that is north, historically north of Birmingham Hill. Most of the battle with the flanking force actually happened around Birmingham Hill, which is what you see here. Those are militia. I believe they're listed as Minutemen in the game. You're seeing me hiding in the forest. The plan of these, my units in the forest was to actually hold a flanking position. I finally started firing on his 6-pounder. Hold a flanking position to try and fire upon any British forces that move farther in to engage with mine. The game does account for hidden units, and so those units, because they're in such thick forested areas, are actually quite hidden. And you can see them marching here on the side. If you watch videos or look at pictures of that sort of thing, of the area around Brandywine where the battle was supposed to take place, it's actually very hilly and very forested. It's not really that easy to traverse. What we're looking at here is German Hessians, paid for and hired by the British to come and fight. You can see them with their little blue outfits as we do a dramatic scroll across the front of the forces. The Hessians are actually fairly effective line infantry for the British. As effective as they are, sometimes it doesn't work out so well if they're in a bad position. And that's one thing you find in this battle as you watch, as we look at the Brandywine here. I don't know why my 24-pounders decided to fire across the I think they're trying to hit something they can't honestly hit. And they're just, they've gone mad trying to fire. Here I'm keeping an eye. Those units in the trees over there are actually scout units. As you recall before, I pointed out the spikes across the Brandywine on the ford way up north. Way up north. It technically way that direction, well, towards where the British forces came from. I laid those spikes fairly early in the fight with some scout units. I snuck over there and laid the spikes and ran away, and my hope was to catch some... They're mainly anti-cavalry. 4 anti-cavalry. To try and catch cavalry unaware. If they charge into it, they take a lot of damage. I don't know how historical it is. We definitely had to get rid of a bunch of American forces that they just didn't have in this battle to make it more historically accurate. The Americans, incidentally, had 2 light dragoons in this fight, and as far as I could tell in any of the sources I looked at, they didn't have really any cavalry in this battle. So we also had to execute those light dragoons in the corner of the map just so that they weren't participant. Okay, here's something you'll see unfortunate. So laying the spikes here actually prevented him from using a lot of his cavalry, which was another big strength that the British had. Because he didn't want to run across those. It was kind of dastardly tactic of mine. But this is his other cannon unit, his 6-pounders. And unfortunately... they also were susceptible to the spikes, which surprised both of us and made Ross quite angry. And so what that signifies is I luckily was able to get a good shot on his other 6-pound artillery unit, and then those died on the spikes, much to our surprise. And so his artillery were fairly ineffective the entire battle. They really didn't do much. Which is unfortunate for the British, because that should be a heavy strength, so to speak, that they carry. So a lot of this comes down to now map position and whether or not they're able to take advantage of the positions that they're in. How successful this flanking attack is going to be. And here are my forces sitting on Birmingham Hill, hiding there. I believe that's a town hall building over there on the left. If you're wondering where Washington's unit is, because there is actually a general unit, he sits on a horse with some bodyguard. He's hiding in some trees somewhere. I'll point him out if I see him. Mainly for the point that losing your general has a massive effect on morale, which is something that's calculated in this game. Most of these forces you see positioned here are line infantry. Here's me checking out the flank. And all of the ineffectual, looks like that's the dead artillery. The ineffectual cavalry. As he's trying to decide what to do with them, because his option at this point is to only really basically charge across Chad's Ford, because he takes a lot of damage with those spikes. I know the spikes go away if the cavalry hits them to any significance, but you don't want to lose forces without them being necessary. It surprises both that the infantry wouldn't just walk by as they were walking past those spikes and pull them out, but there are limitations to any game when used to try and recreate historical events. Historically speaking, this seems, I don't know if I'd claim it as a direct mistake. One of the mistakes that Washington had in the, I don't know if you call it Battle of New York or Siege of New York, is he didn't adequately protect his flank, which seems like what would have happened here. I saw a documentary where somebody asserted the claim that Washington was well aware of the situation, that his gamble was that he knew he was outgunned and outmanned, and his hope was to draw them forward across the ford and then advance across the ford and try and destroy the British, trying to pull them in. As it was described, it was somewhat of a gamble. Clearly it didn't work. Historically, with this flanking maneuver, I recall Cornwallis marched around the flank with something like 8,000 British troops, being covered by about 3,000 American. I've seen a lot of estimates as to the actual forces portrayed on either side. Approximately 15,000 on each side, and I've seen something like 14 on the Americans and upwards of 18 on the British. I don't know how accurate any of the forces are, but that seems a general estimate. What you see here is the long rifle starting to fire upon the British, who aren't aware that they're taking casualties at the moment. I think he's going to start figuring it out. And those casualties actually make quite a bit of difference. One unfortunate, I suppose, historically accurate aspect of the game is something that's is morale. And as his forces on his far right flank, as his line moves forward, take damage, if enough damage is done, then the units have a chance to flee, and each unit has a leadership stat, which is calculated into their odds of fleeing. As you can see, their flag starts to blink and waver, and then they flee. And what happens is, as British units flee, if there are other British units around, then they're also actually affected, and they take a big negative from the effect of other British units fleeing nearby. This goes for any units, of course, but so that actually affects the morale of the other units nearby, so you have this cascading effect of it's a damaging negative to all forces around as soon as forces start fleeing, and so it becomes a real big problem when units start withdrawing or panicking and withdrawing from the field. Now, the goal is to try and get him to advance and deal with the line that's covering my flank here. And I suppose his goal is to try and burst through. And that's why I set up those units on the hill, looking down upon them from up there. That is mainly to prevent them from pivoting around the hill and trying to get around me. And also, if he's going to directly engage my regulars, he's basically going to take a lot of shots from up on the hill. And what happens from up on the hill is, because he's so aware of that, he pulls all of his forces really far to one side to try and prevent a lot of shots from the hill. It looks like I can still hit him. Those long rifles have a ridiculous range. And as you can hear, the exchange start to occur between the two sides. Those are grenadiers on the right here marching forward. And those are British regulars. I think one of the most damaging parts, at least of this part of the battle, of this flanking attack, is how much damage that flanking force did. What you don't see, which I didn't capture directly on the video, is those forces, my line moved completely back a ways closer to where the building is. They moved back, I don't know how they calculate that in feet. The reason I did that was to try and draw them forward and expose their flank more, because they basically would have been a lot more exposed in the middle of that field and forced to sort of advance and deal with my forces there. Now, I'm checking on the other flank over at Chad's Ford to make sure everything's okay. Now, you see on the right in the trees, that's actually Washington heroically hiding in the trees. Here's me firing down upon them. Now, he doesn't really have a lot left. It looks like he has 2 Hessian units and a British regular. One thing we realized, if you try and advance and attack a force, it doesn't seem as effective as if you would array them out. And because I think of how they're positioned, they're not firing the way they need to. Those are a militia unit running into the town hall and breaking the windows so they could fire from the windows. Yeah, and so his units are not really firing as much as they probably could be, or could be more effective. And not as exciting, I guess, or as dramatic, but this is sort of how the flank battle plays out. Now, he does do a lot of damage, because overall the British forces are better than mine, but because of how I positioned myself, I forced him to draw in. He took a lot of flanking damage from the individuals on Birmingham Hill, and and because I got one to flee, it affected the morale of all the other ones, and they became much less effective. Their forces overall are better than mine, which is historically true. I believe the British and the Germans, what you see is a rebuffed Hessian assault, and his cavalry decided to charge in. There were some reports of the Hessians and the Germans actually talking about how surprised they were about how bravely the Americans fought. I changed those 24-pounders, still, once again, ridiculous that the Americans have it, those 24-pounders to a grape shot to fire down upon them, and it seems fairly effective. He's finally able to engage one of the more greater strengths of the British Army at this time, well, historically as well as more so in this battle. A lot of the strength of his army was in cavalry, and they were able to advance and assault the regulars that I have here positioned across the river. We can zoom in here and watch the dramatic battle between the British cavalry and the colonial forces. What you see just across the line there is British Dragoons. I believe there was, they're called Jager, but there were actually Hessian light dragoons. I believe they're light dragoons considered, but they are dragoons. What you don't see is one of the engaged cavalry forces actually withdraw from the hand-to-hand fighting, move around this battle here, and go and take out my artillery, which has been a problem for him the full fight. They're definitely standing awkwardly close to start firing at one another, as we're going to try and reload, firing our pistols here. Right across the way, what you see straight forward on the other side of these, over closer towards the Brandywine River, are a Highland unit. And much to my surprise, a Highland unit existed in this battle. I didn't quite find that there was historically a Highland unit in the battle, but they are here, as you can tell by their kilts. And much to my surprise, Russ decided to charge. Now, after the cavalry charge, and now a charge from angry Scotsmen, my units start to waver. And those wavering units will eventually affect how the rest of the of this side of the battle goes. You see them duking it out. And there I go fleeing. And there goes the other unit, because obviously everybody's affected by routing forces. And here's returning British infantry. They look... I think they're light infantry by the look of them. They don't look like irregulars. I pulled up, what you see on the left is those scout units that I hid in the forest. I pulled them up to actually start to engage and fight them off. They're positioned awkwardly. I should have positioned them in a wider line to get more fire and a better range off of them. But they are actually quite poorly positioned. Here are those cavalry those are dragoons right there that took out the my artillery, and they're harassing my fleeing forces. It looks like they're turning towards my scouts, trying to hold the British back from this side of the battle. And what you're seeing here is I finally was able to mop up the other side of the flanking attack that was theoretically done by Cornwallis, but essentially just whatever. There was no general unit over there in the actual in-game. But my line infantry, my regulars were actually able to move fast enough over to actually participate and help deal with this. I mean, by and large, it was fairly much a massacre on that flanking attack by Ross, but he did what made him more successful, I suppose, on this attack across Chad's Ford. Is I was honestly far too concentrated on what was going on in the flanking side of the battle over by Birmingham Hill that I didn't actually pay attention to what was going on over there. There's Washington heroically hiding in the forest, hiding in the trees. And so he got me unawares, and I wasn't actually able to see the vast majority of what was going on until it was a little bit too late to deal with it effectively. But I was able to bring enough infantry over here to try and deal with and counter what had happened on this flank. At least on this side of the battle. It seems like he decides to run his light dragoons off into the forest, and much to my happiness, I did hide some anti-cavalry spikes in the forest, and it took out a few of his cavalry there. There are my fleeing forces. So, as far as historical significance, Howe did win the battle and chased the Americans off the field, Washington's forces, and Washington fled. I've seen casualties on the British side of 400 or 500, and I've seen casualties on the American side of 400 or 500. It seems more accurate. One source I found said something closer to 12, and the British claims of only 400 or 500 seem possibly slightly inaccurate, because there was one first-hand account of some of the British regulars actually losing upwards of like 600 just for their unit alone. So the losses could be more significant on either side. It just depends on how they reported that information. But yeah, Howe did actually take Philadelphia, which didn't have as great effect on the war and didn't change the war as dramatically as I suppose he would hoped, taking the capital of the American forces. And part of, I guess, the reason for that is the Americans are more provincial, and that a central capital really wouldn't have crippled the Americans' ability to fight. It looks like he's trying to charge Howe's general unit into the fight there. Yeah. So, one thing I learned is artillery is very effective, and unfortunately for the British, they didn't really have the artillery that they wanted. or that they were able to use. The other thing that was very effective was the terrain, which made a big difference because it created this, over by Chaz Fort, a big bottleneck that made it difficult to charge across and sort of concentrate all their forces into, which subjected them to concentrated fire. And concentrating force in mass is definitely one of the main tactics discussed in class. I was able to use stealth and subterfuge by hiding militia as well as long rifle in the forest on Birmingham Hill, using them to fire down upon them, and using, hopefully, as you can see there, the terrain as best as I could to lure his troops in to cause them some battle. Cause them some casualties. No battle in and of itself, no game in and of itself is going to be a perfect one-on-one analog for a historical event. But this seemed fairly enjoyable and accurate. And at the very least, it did teach me quite a bit about the terrain that was used and how important artillery was, and how definitely the Americans did not have the artillery that I actually had present. I destroyed, believe it or not, 3 more units than the ones that were actually present, and that one still managed to do as much damage as it did, as it harassed the British forces on the other side of the Brandywine. Keeping your plan simple, not overcomplicating it. I was able to concentrate my forces in a lot smaller area, using inside lines to be able to maneuver and react and counter to attacks he had. His splitting the forest, much like Howe did, sort of split his massive force and the effectiveness of it, which I suppose in my mind, if I were to replay this as Howe, I might have concentrated on one side or the other. Made it so I wouldn't have to fight across the bottleneck and dealt with it perhaps differently, been a lot more judicious with my artillery. I don't know, it's hard to say. Definitely an armchair general situation, but quite fun and entertaining, especially looking at the events and how they played out differently, where Washington was able to win this fight and historically Howe did. Could it have been different than it played out? Can I look back and armchair general the situation? I suppose, by and large, most accounts are that the British actually did outnumber the Americans in this situation, and that the American forces, the regulars, were not as well trained or seasoned or as effective as the British forces were, especially since they're bringing veteran Hessians and well-trained and disciplined British regulars. The fact that the Americans made it out of the battle with the army intact without having lost a vast significant amount of the forces is also quite significant. And Washington learned more, and the American troops learned more about battle and gained more experience in that situation, which was of great benefit and invaluable for future endeavors. Historically, there was Cornwallis, there was Howe on the one side. His name escapes me at the moment, but the individual that created the breech loading rifle, or created, I guess, discovered or designed the breech loading rifle, fought on the British side and was commanding Hessians. The Americans had notable names like Anthony Wayne, John Sullivan, Nathaniel Greene, which became well known for his exploits in the South. Lafayette was actually present in the battle, and from what I had heard, he was injured during the fighting. So yeah, it was an enjoyable fight, and there was a lot to learn from what had happened, trying to understand the battle itself and then play it out and see how it played out in comparison to how things did historically. But this was the full video, uncut, and obviously pause here at the moment, for the USU 4810 project. And that would be it for me.